Okay. So with that introduction to today's material, let me begin. Just one moment. So I have recapitulated here very briefly the key equations which we discussed yesterday. How to define the tangent space to the unit sphere in the Hilbert space at any point of it. Here is that definition. Here is the subspace of the tangent space, which is the vertical part, and which follows in a very natural way from the first definition. Then we have this special one form, and one form is like a covariant vector field, a cotangent vector at each point of the manifold on which you are working. So it is defined by saying what it does to any tangent vector. So in all these expressions, psi is a general normalized vector in Hilbert space. Phi is a vector in the tangent space T psi at B, Tb at the point psi, V psi, this is a vertical, and so the same notation. So in this action of the one form, psi is a unit vector, phi is a general vector in the Hilbert space, obeying this condition. Real part of inner product psi phi has to be 0. Then once the one form is given, it helps you to define the horizontal subspace of the tangent space. It is that subspace on which the one form A gives value 0. So sometimes I will use this notation. You have the Hilbert space. Suppose you choose some unit vector psi, and then you want to consider all vectors in the Hilbert space perpendicular to psi. So I will denote it in this way. The subspace of the full Hilbert space orthogonal to the given vector psi. So you can say the horizontal subspace at a point psi is exactly this one, all right? And the full tangent space is the direct sum of the two. Then I have this formula which tells you how the exterior derivative of A, how it acts. Being a second rank quantity or a two form, it acts on pairs of vectors in the tangent space, and because it's a two form, it must have antisymmetry. So you can see this imaginary part of the scalar Hilbert space inner product is indeed antisymmetric. Now, to many of you, these notions, these notations may be quite familiar, but there may be some for whom it is new. So I just thought of asking you very quickly to give me the answers to some of the questions. Oh, maybe I just finished. This is the analogous set of relations for, sorry, I made a mistake here, but this has been recorded for posterity on the video, right? At the ray space, at each point rho being psi adjoint for some psi, the tangent space to ray space, it is useful to be able to describe it in several ways from calculational point of view. One is to say it consists of all Hermitian operators on the full Hilbert space which have 0 trace and which obey this algebraic condition. And we saw yesterday how this is derived. The anti-commutator of B with the density matrix rho must give you B. In turn, each such B can be described in the way I have written here. So you can see that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the tangent space to the ray space at a given point and vectors in the subspace of Hilbert space orthogonal to psi. I am using the symbol chi for vectors here, so you can see how this works out. And it's interesting, sometimes useful to see that the same thing can also be written in terms of the commutator of rho with another operator k, and I've given all the expressions. So now we see that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the tangent space to ray space at each point and this subspace of Hilbert space. That is the important thing I want you to appreciate. Okay? One-to-one correspondence between them. So now, as I said, I just want to quickly ask a few questions, only directed at those to whom some of these things may be new. It is not meant for those who are already familiar, just so that you are comfortable with the idea of the tangent space. I'll go over it quickly. Suppose you take Euclidean n-dimensional real space, and suppose X denotes a point in n-dimensional Rn, then I repeat, someone to whom this may be new, not those who are already familiar, what do you think this is? The tangent space to Euclidean space at a point of Euclidean space. Huh? Rn. Yeah, so all of you who have answered are familiar with these things. I wondered if there's anybody not very familiar. That's fine. So this is essentially Rn. Then suppose you take the circle in the plane, and you parameterize points with the usual polar angle theta. What would be the tangent space to the circle at any point of it? So we would say it is R. What about, and this is something we have done yesterday, you take a point on S2 with spherical polar angles theta phi and ask what is the T of that? R2. Good. So all of you are really quite familiar, comfortable with this. Now I ask, and this will be my last question, suppose you have a Hilbert space, complex linear vector space of any dimension, and phi is a vector in the Hilbert space. What is the tangent space to H at that point? H itself. Because there is no condition that you are dealing with a unit vector or anything like that. In particular, phi could be the zero vector also, nothing to stop you. Huh? So this is just to see that you are all feeling comfortable with this notation, with these ideas. Okay. So now a couple of comments about this, and then I will pick up. This dA, I have not given you any details of calculation, how one sets it up, how one evaluates it, and how one gets this answer. I just want to give a little indication, and that is the following. Suppose this is the point psi in the space B. Then phi describes a possible displacement of psi. It's a tangent vector to the space at psi. Phi dash would be another possible small displacement of psi. Correct? So given a pair of two tangent vectors at psi, they describe two different infinitesimal displacements you can imagine. Given these two, locally you can construct a parallelogram. So what you can do is take that one form A, calculate its line integral round this parallelogram. Go along phi, then go a little bit along phi dash, then return by phi and return by phi dash, negative of phi dash, back to the starting point. And then you can ask, what is the value of that integral over the four sides of this parallelogram? A is a one form, so it can be integrated along any curve, continuous curve. So what is its value? That value, whatever it is, defines for you the curl, the exterior derivative of A. It's a two form, and whatever value you get for this is this thing. So if you want to attempt, to get familiar with this notation and derive this on your own, this is the way to do it. Okay? So you can see that this is using Stokes' theorem in the most general context to arrive at the differential of a one form. Just want you to see that. Okay. Then there was one other statement I made yesterday towards the end, I think. I showed you that ultimately geometric phases are symplectic areas. That is, the geometric phase, it is, you have no loss of generality in calculating the geometric phase for a closed loop in the race space. Then all you have to do is to choose a two-dimensional surface whose boundary is the loop. And then the geometric phase for that is the integral of this omega over that surface. So I called it a symplectic area. I just want you to appreciate, for those whom this is new, first of all, working at the level of race space, there is no natural way in which to express this geometric phase as a contour integral. There is no way. The natural interpretation and expression is as a symplectic area. Why is there no contour integral representation? Because this two form omega, which exists on race space, is closed. Its curl is 0, but it is not exact. It is not the curl of something. If it had been the curl of something, we would have used Stokes' theorem. And the surface integral of omega could be converted into a line integral of the thing from which it arises by the curl operation. But it is not of that nature. It is closed but not exact. So there is no natural way to think of geometric phase at the race space level in terms of some integration operation along the loop itself. You must cover it by a membrane and integrate over that. The other part I want to emphasize is this nature of this symplectic area. Now, when you look at the Pancharatnam situation or any two-level system, invariably geometric phases have turned out to be solid angles at the origin of S2. So that looks very much like area on the Euclidean area on the surface S2. When I did the while phase yesterday for one canonical pair of variables q and p, you translate by amount A along q, the amount B along p, and come back, the geometric phase was A times B, which is the area of a rectangle in the phase space. So it may make you think that when I say geometric phase is a symplectic area, maybe that area is very much like ordinary area in the plane or area on the surface S2 and so on. This is not so. Symplectic areas are very different from Euclidean type areas. Symplectic area is based on symplectic geometry. Euclidean areas are based on Euclidean geometry. And symplectic geometry is fundamentally different from Euclidean geometry. So please keep this in mind. So these low dimensional examples may give a wrong impression in your mind that geometric phases are in some way like Euclidean area. They are not at all like Euclidean areas. Okay. So now next what I want to do is to give a local description of all these things and objects. So,
can you give an example in which such symplectic area does not look like an Euclidean area?
See, what happens is that in two-level systems, it's not possible. Okay. One thing we have seen, race space geodesics become ordinary geodesics on this Poincare sphere. Symplectic areas become solid angles. So you have to go to at least 3 dimensions, and then a visualization becomes difficult. But a 3-dimensional case, we have done some work years ago, and a much more thorough analysis has been done a couple of years ago, right, by Goyal, Singh, and Neeti and Sudha. It is quite elaborate, lot of geometry, lot of algebra. So it's not, but in principle, I will show you tomorrow probably the ways in which this idea of symplectic area is very different. Basically, one can say in Euclidean geometry, the scalar product of two vectors is symmetric in the two vectors, correct? A dot B is B dot A, and Euclidean space means it is basically length of A times length of B times the cosine of the angle between them. That is scalar product in Euclidean geometry. In symplectic geometry, the scalar product of a vector A and a vector B, first it is antisymmetric in the two. Second, the word symplectic has a Greek origin. Symplectic means probably,
So Euclidean also has a Greek origin.
yeah. But there was no Mr. Symplectic, I think. You're right. But I believe there is the meaning originally is the idea of a braid. What is a braid? Now, braid is there used in groups also, and for identical particles, braid group. I don't know that subject very well, but it is like, I'll give you an image in a moment. It is like taking two strings and interweaving them again and again. The meaning of the word symplectic is given in Hermann Weyl's book, not the one on space-time matter, but the classical groups. The meaning of the original word, what it meant, is given. And the usual image is the way that girls, women in India in olden times used to wear their hair, not bob, but long one. And you take two strands, go like this and like this, interwoven. That is the idea of the word symplectic. Huh?
That may be non-existent, but I think they will understand from Venus Williams.
Who? Oh, okay.
Because
Yeah.
something familiar.
Yeah. You're right. Yeah. So, but let me now show you graphically how it happens. Suppose you have a classical phase spaces, many Q's and many P's. Just imagine it is like Euclidean 2n dimensional. Then, if you have one phase space point QP and another phase space point Q prime P prime, the symplectic scalar product of these two is the following: Q1 P2 prime minus Q2 P1 prime plus Q3 P4 prime minus Q4. No, I'm making some mistake here. Maybe Simon, I need your help. What is it? Something like this, Q4 P3 prime. But I'm not getting
Q1 P1 prime.
Huh?
Q1 P1 prime.
Q1, you're right. Q1 P1 prime minus
P1 Q1 prime.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Q1 prime P1.
Plus. Okay. Second. Yeah.
2, 3.
Q2 P2 prime minus P2 Q2 prime plus and so on like this. So you see what we mean by plaiting the hair or braid. So this is the idea of scalar product in symplectic geometry, and this does not, it cannot be pictured in terms of trigonometry. There is no such idea as angle between two vectors given by the scalar product and so on. So that is why, so I'm saying it now that please always remember geometric phases are areas in the sense of symplectic geometry. So the intuition one may have from Euclidean geometry is completely wrong in this context.
Can I add?
Yeah, yeah.
add one more
Please,
comment?
please.
I think I will just give an indication to Ara's question.
Yeah.
See, if you take just 2 dimensions,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
area is volume.
Yeah.
And volume preserving transformations are the same as area preserving transformation.
Yeah, yeah.
Usually the volume preserving group is called SL in R. So symplectic group in 2 dimension and SL group in 2 dimension are the same. But if you go to 4 phase space,
Yeah, yeah.
it's very different.
Yeah, that is.
Now, so volume and
Yeah.
area become different here. See? So the symplectic group is a much smaller group of SL.
Of
SL, I mean, 2n
volume
or
preserving.
any n greater than 1.
Yeah.
Now, maybe I think, see, recently I heard some energy physicist asked me, oh, do you know symplectic camel? So I went to, I mean, this is not,
Symplectic?
I'm not going for time passing, but I think
Symplectic?
Camel.
What you're talking about dinner yesterday, the camel.
I don't
Khan.
know, I was not there.
Khan.
Huh?
Khan and
No,
the
no,
camel.
it's not that camel, this is symplectic camel.
Oh, not the Arab and the camel.
No.
Yeah.
Now, apparently, you know, see this Liouville's theorem says canonical transformations preserve volume.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay? In 2-dimensional phase space, it's a complete statement.
Yeah.
But in beyond the 2-dimensional
Yeah,
phase
yeah.
space,
Yeah.
it's a very restricted statement.
Yeah, yeah.
So somebody, I mean, suppose you have a ball of radius r and you want to push it through a cylinder. I mean, if you are in higher dimension,
Yeah.
where in 2 dimension alone you restrict it to be a circle, so it is circle times the rest of the dimension, you have the entire freedom. Can you push it through? You cannot push it through. Because, I mean, this, every pairwise there is constraint. I mean, it's a lot more constraint. This is apparently, there's a very important issue in mathematics, symplectic manifold.
Okay.
And Gramo or somebody proved it, and it's a very famous thing. I learned it only recently.
But we have known for 2000 years, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than for you or me to reach the kingdom of God, right? Maybe they knew it at that time, right? Camel through the eye of the needle. Right. I think that's where it.
Correct, yeah.
Huh?
So this is a symplectic camel cannot go through it.
Yeah, right. So there is a connection, really. The image is connected. Okay. So now, some of these things I want to give a local description because it is useful sometimes when you want to do practical calculations. And I remember a very nice phrase from Feynman's lectures on gravitation. All these small sentences are always in my mind, like Hermann Weyl. Somewhere he says, is it all right to verify something or prove something using a local description, something which is not valid globally? And he says, there is no sense of defeat in doing a local calculation. As long as you know the full thing, if you find it convenient for something to do a local calculation, please go ahead and do it. One knows that when you work on the sphere S2, there is no global coordinate system, right? Any spherical polar angles are not well defined at the 2 poles. And any system of coordinates on S2 will be not well defined, at least at one point. But that need not stop us from carrying out all our calculations. So in that spirit,
The important thing that I wanted to add, I did not.
Please.
I mean, in higher dimension, suppose you are in 4 dimension or 6 dimension, you are given a curve. Okay? And area of the surface, 2 surfaces determined by the curve makes no sense. I mean, given a curve in 4 dimension, I mean, what is the 2 surfaces defined by it? It makes no sense because it has, you can do it in infinite number of ways and you will have infinite different areas, but the symplectic area
is
will
always
be specified as soon as it's given. I think that is the
that is
most
very good.
important thing.
Yeah,
So given a closed curve,
yeah,
there is a well-defined symplectic area, irrespective of what is the diameter.
Actually, even in 3 dimensions.
yeah.
No, but 3
There's
is
a
not,
curve in 3.
that's correct, yeah.
It's
but-
not simple, but you can
Yeah,
visualize
because
it.
that's why I said 4, yeah.
The solid angle is different from the area of the.
Yeah, yeah. Correct.
So you always talk about even dimensions.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but in
yeah.
2 dimension, given a curve, I mean, the surface is there, you have no freedom. There is there's no freedom to distinguish between the general surface and the unique one. There's nothing, there is only one.
So now I will describe to you a simple-minded way of trying to describe these spaces locally in such a way that you can do simple calculations without too much difficulty. So I will use this part of the board to draw a diagram, and then I will not rub it, I will not modify it, etc. So here is our ray space, as always. Here is the space B, and this is the projection operation, pi. All right. Now, I want to show you a way of describing this space, ray space, locally and correspondingly B. Take some point rho 0 in the ray space. All right. I'll be using equations also, so I'll do it step by step. So let us say rho 0 is some point in the ray space, and I will choose some psi 0 in the fiber on top of rho 0. Let us say this is the fiber, and here is a particular psi 0 I choose for definiteness. Then I will define a certain neighborhood of this point rho 0. I will give it a name. I will call it script m. Maybe I should say script n for neighborhood, but in my notes I have written m. So let us define this m in the following way. It is all those points in ray space with the property that they are not orthogonal to rho 0. This is the definition of this neighborhood. So it means that, sorry, am I going back and forth? It means that if I take any point rho in this neighborhood, and if I look at its fiber, every vector sitting on top of rho has a non-zero scalar product with psi 0. Non-zero scalar product. What are the vectors in what portion of the ray space is not covered by this neighborhood? All those which come from vectors orthogonal to psi. Those you are leaving out. So this is a local description. It's a description of a part of the ray space. So now what I can say is, for any rho within this neighborhood, so I'll put it like this, take rho in this neighborhood, you pick a representative for it such that, well, you know that psi 0, psi inner product has to be non-zero. That's the definition of the neighborhood, such that this is real positive. Pick psi to represent each rho in this neighborhood by arranging that this scalar product has no phase, and that means that it is real positive, which means in the language we used already, psi 0 is chosen once and for all in this construction. For each other point rho, choose some psi in phase with psi 0 in the Pancharatnam sense. Okay? All right. So this is clear. So this is the meaning of this choice of psi. And this psi can be uniquely decomposed into a component parallel to psi 0 and a component orthogonal to psi 0. Clearly, right? And what we know, so I will write these expressions here, the coefficients of these things, and then you will see immediately where it all comes from. Take this psi, which is in phase with psi 0. It has a non-zero projection along psi 0 by the definition of this neighborhood. So it is a positive real number times psi 0 plus something orthogonal to psi 0. If the rho is different from rho naught, there will be some component orthogonal to psi 0. That means that that orthogonal piece lies in this part of Hilbert space. And being a unit vector overall, it is clear that the coefficient, the multiple of psi 0 appearing here must be 1 minus the length squared of this fellow. So that overall it is a unit vector. And the fact that this is non-zero tells you this part orthogonal to psi naught is inside the unit sphere in the orthogonal complement. All right. So I'm sorry, this may look a little bit elaborate, but this is all that one has to do. So this is my equation 511. So each row in the neighborhood, you pick a representative vector for it in phase with psi 0 in this way. Now what is the most general vector on the fiber on top of rho? It will be this representative point multiplied by some phase. All right. So one can see now, I hope you appreciate that. I'll just write it and then give more details. Chi 0 is a coordinate in a generalized sense for M. Every point in this neighborhood of rho 0 uniquely corresponds to some chi naught, a vector in Hilbert space in the subspace of H orthogonal to psi 0 and with length strictly less than 1. And then you can say that chi 0 along with that phase alpha is a, not coordinate, I should say coordinate system, I don't know what to say, is a coordinate in general sense for the inverse image of this neighborhood in B. So a point within this region in the base corresponds uniquely to some choice of chi naught. And that's the description I've given there. And so now what is the region of B for which this local coordinate system works? It is this whole cylinder or tube or whatever you like to call it. Every point in this unit sphere B within this region, the inverse image of M is completely specified by chi naught and this phase angle. Correct? So this is a local coordinate system for this portion of the unit sphere on Hilbert space. And now what I will do is the following.
Can you make random
Yeah.
The length equal to 1 is the boundary.
Beg your pardon?
The length chi naught equal to 1
Yeah.
is the boundary of this.
It is to be omitted. It is not included in the region M.
Actually, the comment I was going to.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you said neighborhood, you never said small neighborhood or epsilon neighborhood.
No, I didn't say that. I
And in
didn't
the
say
case of
didn't say that.
Poincare sphere, in the case of
Ah.
two-zone system,
Yeah.
this will just omit one point.
One. Yeah, okay.
I mean, in the,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
in
okay.
every case, it will omit only a measure zero set of points, actually.
Yeah.
Because the number of fellows orthogonal is going to be a smaller dimension. But
Yeah.
I think in the case of,
Yeah, yeah.
so this is not a, I mean, I think normally we are used to thinking
Yeah.
that neighborhoods are very tiny fellows.
Yeah, yeah, it's
But
not
this
tiny.
is, I mean,
Yeah.
in the case of sphere, you
Yeah,
take
yeah,
any
it's-
point, it omits only the diametrically opposite.
Yeah,
point. I mean, that's the comment
Yeah.
I wanted, so that people can
Yeah,
actually
yeah, yeah.
go back to the
Yeah, yeah.
simplest case and actually work out the.
Correct. And you should do it if it is something you're meeting for the first time. But if my Hilbert space was a dimension 10, just for argument's sake, what you're omitting is a 9-dimensional subspace of the 10-dimensional Hilbert space. Because you're omitting everything orthogonal to psi 0. That you cannot handle. So if you say a 9-dimensional subspace is a subspace of measure 0, you can say so. But so you see why it is a local description. All right. So now we are almost home. So what shall I rub? I think I can rub these things. Let this be there.
But in response to this boundary,
Yeah,
I think you are saying, what you are saying that in R this is an open set. I mean, the
Beg your pardon?
neighborhood will be a
Yeah, yeah.
Pakka open
Yeah,
set.
it has no
Or it is
yeah.
neighborhood in the mathematics.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is not a closed subset. What I've drawn as this oval, this potato, the skin of the potato is not included. All right. So now we are almost home. What I will do is the following. So we have psi 0, and we have the subspace of the full Hilbert space orthogonal to psi 0. So if the H was a dimension n, this is a dimension n minus 1. It's a Hilbert space on its own. Then suppose you choose any orthonormal basis ER for this part. So R goes over this many values. If dimension of the full space is n, one vector has been removed. So for its orthogonal complement, if you want an orthonormal basis, that's the number of vectors you need. In that case, you can say the psi 0 along with these e's is an orthonormal basis for the full Hilbert space, obviously, right? You take psi 0, which is a unit vector, and then you have basis vectors, orthonormal basis for the complement of psi 0, orthogonal complement of psi 0. Now we are home. This chi naught, which is appearing there, which is a coordinate, it completely describes a point rho in this neighborhood. It is orthogonal to psi 0, so it can be expanded uniquely with complex coefficients in terms of this orthonormal basis ER. All right. So I will write chi 0 as, now I use this normalization for reasons which you will see soon. I will expand it in this form. And the condition on this Q's and P's is that the sum of the squares of the Q's and P's should be strictly less than 2, because the norm of chi must be strictly less than 1. All right? So now what can we say? that the set QR PR, r equals 1, 2 to n minus 1 are local coordinates over the region M of race space. And then QR, PR, and alpha are local coordinates over the portion of the unit sphere in Hilbert space which is sitting on top of M. Just one additional phase angle has to be added to get a coordinate system for this portion of the full space. All right. Now I think I can rub some of these things out, and I will write the expressions for the various forms and so on. And I think what you see will be quite nice for you. This one form A, what does it look like in this local coordinate description? I want to show you what A looks like at a general point up here. And the general point here is this psi prime. It's not psi. Psi is a carefully chosen representative of each row. It is chosen so that it is in phase with psi naught in the Pancharatnam sense. So general point I'm dealing with is psi prime. So partly what I'm writing is somewhat formal, but we can actually compute things more explicitly also. This is the expression for the one form A at any general point in this local, in this neighborhood of script B. And remember, psi prime is e to the power I alpha times psi. Psi depends only on chi 0. See, you can say psi is a function of chi 0. Right? So I had written it earlier. No? Psi is a positive coefficient times psi 0 plus the orthogonal piece, chi 0. So when you compute this, here is what you find. And this I will leave as an exercise. It's very simple, but it is nice to do it. Please do not omit this. And when you finish the calculation, I feel you will feel symplectically happy. This is the expression you get for this one form in this coordinate system. There is a piece coming from the phase factor, d alpha. And then this is the contribution from the orthogonal part, the chi 0. So it has this form in terms of q's and p's. It looks so much like classical mechanical phase space expressions. It's simple to calculate and get this result. I'm not saying it is trivial. You have to do a little bit of calculation. Okay? So I will leave it to you to do that. The exterior derivative of this will be sum over r dpr wedge dqr. I'm not explaining this notation. You must learn it somewhere or sometime. And our symplectic two form omega on the ray space locally at a point rho, you can, in this description, it is the same formal expression. Sorry. This is my equation 513. All this together is 513. So now you had asked a question yesterday. Well, can we see why A does not arise from some one form existing at the level of the ray space? Only dA is so. here is a local description of that. It is this piece in the one form defined at the level of vectors, which is the obstruction. There is no coordinate alpha at ray space. The coordinates for ray space are q's and p's only. For the full space, there is in addition the phase angle. So the one form A has this piece, and that is the, if you say, so it is not arising from the lower level. But when you take its exterior derivative, the D symbol of differential geometry, this one goes away. And you have only the PQ contribution. And then you can say this two form at the vector level is the result of pullback acting on a two form at the ray level. And in local coordinates, they have exactly similar appearance. You should not say they are equal. We should say that dA in the notation of differential geometry is written in that form. But in local description, it amounts to an identity of the expressions. Okay. So I hope that you see that how all these things hang together. So this is the main thing that you need to calculate, and you must do this. So locally, it looks like our ray space is like a classical phase space. It is describable by canonical type variables QR and PR, and the symplectic structure, the omega, is given exactly as in classical mechanics with ordinary phase space we are familiar with. The only thing is that these variables QP we have introduced are locally defined. They are not globally well defined on the whole of the ray space. So it is not possible to describe all of the ray space with a single set of canonical coordinates Q's and P's. If you take S2, it is a symplectic manifold. It has a symplectic structure, and some of you may have known, may have seen the omega in the case of S2 is sine theta d theta wedge d phi in terms of the usual spherical polar angles. This is a perfectly well defined two form. You may wonder what happens at the north pole and the south pole where theta and phi are not well defined. Sine theta will vanish. So there is no problem in the structure of omega. There's another simpler way to see that. Apart from a numerical factor, it is actually, apart from half or something like that, xj dxk wedge dxl, where x1, x2, x3 are the Cartesian coordinates of a point on S2. So they are not independent. The x1 squared plus x2 squared plus x3 squared is unity. But the Cartesian coordinates are globally well defined. It is when you want to reduce the number of independent variables to 2, because S2 is two-dimensional, then you will have problems. But to show that this is well defined, it has no singularity anywhere on S2, this is a better way to see that. Okay? All right. So what I want to stress.
But isn't that this particular omega?
Huh?
Isn't that the omega you have written that sine theta d theta was infinity?
Yeah.
Is coming because of you were choosing the metric, the canonical metric on S2.
Sure, sure, sure.
If you choose it in the right, another way that would
Sure, sure,
another
sure, sure.
one form will come.
Yeah, yeah.
Form will come.
But this is the one that we most of the time use, which is SO3 invariant. It's the way in which we use it. It is also the one appropriate for viewing S2 as a symplectic manifold. This is the two form which makes S2 a classical like phase space. That's all I'm saying. This way of writing it in Cartesian coordinates helps you to see that it is singularity free. It is globally well defined. And the other thing I want to mention is that there was this question, the statement I made yesterday, that this omega, it is a 2 form on the race space, and it is closed, which means its exterior derivative is 0. It is also non-degenerate. I did not explain exactly what I meant by that yet. I think I hinted at it. This expression shows you point by point it is non-degenerate. What does it mean to be non-degenerate? It is like this. You take any point in the race space and take any 2 tangent vectors to the race space at that point, B and B prime in earlier notation of today. This expression, it's antisymmetric in B and B prime. Non-degenerate means if this is 0 for all B prime, it implies B is 0. That is the meaning of non-degenerate. It's a bilinear object. It's linear in B prime, but antisymmetric. But the non-degeneracy is this statement. And usually in symplectic geometry, instead of the Euclidean metric tensor, we have a tensor called the symplectic metric. And remember, this is always in 2n dimensions for some n. It's always in even dimensions. And the matrix which plays the role of metric tensor, metric definition of scalar products in even dimensional symplectic spaces is this thing. It is antisymmetric, but its determinant is non-zero. That is a non-degeneracy part. Okay? So I will stop with this discussion here. I just wanted to show you what things look like locally. Very much all the structures one is familiar with in classical mechanics come. So R is really like a classical phase space. However, for 2-dimensional Hilbert space, any finite number, R equals Cpn minus 1, these Q's and P's are only locally valid. But what is it in the sense of Feynman? Why is there no sense of defeat in looking at things in this way? You choose one neighborhood, do all of this. Any operation you like to do, it is legitimate. Then you say, now I want to look at parts of race space not covered in this neighborhood. Then the answer is, yeah, choose some other neighborhood, M prime, overlapping with this, but which goes beyond also. So over that you will have Q prime and P prime. And then another M double prime and so on. As long as you have well-defined local coordinates on each neighborhood and well-defined rules of transition in the overlaps. In the overlapping region, you must have good equations which tell you Q prime is such and such a function of QP, P prime is such and such a function of QP, and they must be invertible. Then everything is all right. Okay? So this is the spirit of local patches of coordinates. They help you to do calculations. And I think many things become, at least for me, this has been very helpful to view it in this way. If you can arrive at these conclusions without using local coordinates, good for you. That's all I can say. Okay? All right. So I think I have.
But
yeah.
Most computations can be done only with local coordinates, right?
I think so.
Suppose you don't have any coordinates at all, can you actually compute something?
I don't. I have a feeling suppose you want to calculate the perihelion shift of Mercury. I don't think it's possible to do it in a coordinate independent way. I would imagine you have to use r theta phi at some stage. But it's a matter of judgment, I suppose, how powerful your mathematical skills are. I give sometimes an analogy. In quantum mechanics, most theoretical chemists would, at least earlier days, would be very familiar with the idea of wave functions. but maybe uneasy with Dirac-Ket and Bra formalism. Once you get used to it, it becomes better. Bargmann was not comfortable with differential forms. He said they are just covariant antisymmetric tensor fields. So he was comfortable with that. But I think one has to live with the times. My impression is for practical calculations, you must have the agility to do this kind of thing. For general theorems and results, deep connections, you must be able to think globally. You must be able. So for younger people, I would say, please develop both. For me, time is gone. I have a lot of difficulty doing things without coordinates. I follow Feynman. No sense of defeat in using coordinates. All right. Now, if you look at this Misner, Thorne, and Wheeler book on gravitation, they give so much effort into developing this differential geometric machinery. The whole book is 1,000 pages. Several hundred pages go into developing this machinery. I think they have probably overdone it, but I think Chandrasekhar said when Misner, Thorne, Wheeler book came, and it,
Three different people wrote a book without each of them knowing what the other.
He said that. What I remember he saying in reviewing it was, if Landau and Lifshitz can describe the whole subject in 100 pages, do you need 1,000 pages? This is what I believe he said. So anyway, my advice, whether it is solicited or not, to younger people is, please develop the skill on both sides. There are some things which you understand much better deeply if you are able to see it from the global point of view. So, okay, it's a practical calculation versus better understanding. All right, now I come to the next topic. And that is the Fubini's 2D Riemannian metric on ray space, which is what Professor Hassan has been waiting for. So I hope to complete it today and then go on to other things. Okay. Yeah. So here it is. So this is subsection D of my section 5. I'll give you a description of this. Now, suppose we start, as we did earlier, with a sufficiently smooth parametrized curve in the ray space. Then I have given you a way to compute the length functional. It was an integral over the parameter, but in a reparametrization invariant manner. And what we did was, we said, let us take any lift of this to the level of unit vectors. So this is living here. And in terms of this psi of s and the derivative with respect to s, we were able to compute the length functional. And this expression was in equation 3.15 in the notes. Now, if you look at the expression for the length of a curve in the, maybe I can modify this diagram. Well, let us see. When I need to, I will do that. You can see from the expression for the length functional that the element of length, the infinitesimal length, when you integrate, you get the full length of the curve. This, you will remember, was the following expression. sorry, this is the element of the length squared. This I give it the equation number 515. So by integrating dl along the curve, we were able to produce the length functional. This is important to realize that it is reparameterization invariant. If you were to change the definition of parameter S by some monotone replacement, because the expression within the curly brackets is quadratic in velocities, and I'm talking about square of the length, the right-hand side is reparameterization invariant, and therefore dl is a geometric quantity. It depends only on the curve that you are drawing. It does not depend on how you parameterize the points of the curve. So maybe it is useful now to modify this diagram a little bit. So here is some curve C, and here is any lift of it. And here is a point along the curve, and here is the vector along its lift. All right. And so psi of s is here, and psi dot is a tangent vector here, the velocity, and here is the expression for the square of the length. So you can see that if you take a point rho of s along the curve in the ray space, there is a corresponding tangent to the ray space at that point. At each point of the ray space, you have a corresponding tangent space, which I wrote first thing today. And now, what is the most general element in that tangent space? What does it look like? Well, I had some expressions a little while ago. B has the form, in the operator sense, psi of s chi dagger plus chi. This was one of the three forms in which I wrote elements in the tangent to the ray space. So this would be a general element of the tangent to R at this point. So I don't know how to indicate it. I may just draw something like a plane touching R at that point. So suppose you say that you're traveling along this curve, and at this point, your curve is pointing in the direction of this tangent vector. So what does it mean? It means you start at a point rho of s, and then you reach a nearby point on that curve by saying that it is rho of s plus small change in parameter times the tangent vector you have chosen there. All right? This is natural definition of tangent vector. So there are three terms here now. Rho of s, what is it? It is psi dagger plus delta s, and B has two terms. Right? So this is the nearby term, a nearby point at s plus delta s. So let us say it is here, s plus delta s. Now what is this? For what vector, state vector, is this the projection operator? You can see this is essentially, apart from quadratic terms in delta s, this can be written as psi, shifted psi times psi dagger, where this is psi of s plus delta s chi. Just put this into this expression, and you will get all the terms in the first line. You are neglecting terms of order delta S squared. That is a chi squared term. Chi dagger you neglect. All right. So from this you can read off. Now you go back to the expression for the element of length covered from S to S plus delta S, and you will find that this means this element of length for the small stretch of the curve is, and this I leave as a very simple exercise. Because you know, from here you see that the velocity d psi by ds is just chi. This fellow minus psi divided by delta S. So psi dot is chi, and so this is chi inner product with itself, and this part is 0 because chi is orthogonal to psi. So this is the expression for the infinitesimal length along the curve, any curve, and now you see that this can be written in a very nice form. It is trace of rho at that point times the square of b ds squared. I have given b somewhere, there it is. You can easily convince yourself when you do this, you will get exactly the left-hand side. I want to be able to write this factor of ds, multiplying ds squared, in terms of the tangent vector at this point. So tangent vector pointing along the curve is my element b in the tangent space. Okay, so this is little bit of very elementary algebra. You will see that this is.
Just a small bit.
Yeah.
Chi belongs to H plus, H orthogonal.
To orthogonal to?
But this phi dot in general is not.
Say that again.
With the psi dot
Yeah,
in
yeah.
general is not.
In general is not.
So
But because this is so, this term does not contribute. Okay? So calculated in this way, you have already projected away the component of psi dot in the direction of psi. You removed that already. Correct. So you are quite right. So this is equation 518. So what does this mean? The square of the length is certain expression times the square of the increment in the parameter. This tells you this is the metric tensor for this problem. You can say that at any point, so I now abstract from here, at any point rho in the ray space, if I take a tangent vector to the ray space in the capital B description, then I can say the idea of length tells me that the metric at that point calculated for the tangent vector B is trace rho B squared. This is the key idea. Now I just repeat something which you probably already know. Covariant tensorial objects are various kinds of linear functionals or multilinear functionals on tangent spaces. So the one form A was a linear functional on tangent space giving you a real number. The differential of A is a second rank covariant object, antisymmetric. The matrix tensor is second rank covariant as we know from Riemannian geometry, but symmetric. That's the difference between the Riemannian metric and the symplectic two form. So from this we can immediately say there is a procedure called by the procedure of polarization. You know what that means? From here you can immediately read off the more general form of the metric for two independent tangent vectors at a point rho, our Fubini's 2D metric is 1/2 trace of rho anti-commutator B with B prime. Now this is unambiguous, it has to be so. There is no choice about it. It is like saying that in ordinary Euclidean space, if you know the dot product of all vectors with themselves, you know dot products of different vectors also. If you know x dot x for all x, you know x dot y for different x and y. What is the formula? Take x plus y whole squared minus x minus y whole squared and divide by 4. It's a unique prescription. That's called the procedure of polarization. So this expression for the way in which that metric tensor, the Fubini's 2D metric tensor, acts on a pair of tangent vectors, it follows unambiguously from the previous one. Okay. And now this can be computed. Now you know we have so many ways of describing B. We have a description in terms of its trace and other algebraic properties. We have this description also. So I will use such a description for B and a similar description for B prime. B will involve a vector chi orthogonal to psi. B prime will be chi prime. So you put all this thing into the machinery, and this will turn out to be chi prime. Real part of the inner product of chi with chi prime. I am repeating, this is a very simple calculation. So please go through these steps. The spirit has been, we have long ago defined what we mean by the length of a continuous curve in the ray space. We want to extract from it a metric tensor, Riemannian metric tensor at each point along the curve. This is the procedure. Okay. So the algebra involved is quite elementary. So this is the representation, the expression for the Fubini's 2D metric. It's a Riemannian metric on the ray space. And now comes the icing on the cake. We already had an expression for a symplectic structure on a pair of tangent vectors. Can you remember what, can you dictate what it was? It was, B and B prime. And I or minus I or something, or half, or something is there.
There's a minus.
Minus I, huh? No half or anything? I don't remember now. Oh, yeah. I'll just better get it all correctly. Yeah, let me minus I times trace this one. All right. And now we have shown that the Riemannian metric is 1/2 trace rho anti-commutator B with B prime. Now, by the way, what was this in this chi description? Imaginary part chi with chi prime. And what have we seen here now for this fellow? Real part of chi prime, right? So you put all the ingredients into the mixer, not mixture, into the grinder, and here is the beautiful result. Take any point of ray space take any two tangent vectors to ray space at that point and compute this trace. In terms of the description of B and B prime via vectors chi in the way I have described, this is just inner product in Hilbert space of chi with chi prime. And now you put all the things together, it is G B prime plus I by 2 omega rho B with B prime. This is the master formula, and it is really very beautiful. I want you to appreciate that this is a Hilbert space scalar product. Of course, here it is only the scalar product between pairs of vectors orthogonal to psi that is appearing. That's all right. But if psi varies, the subspace to which chi and chi prime belong, that will also keep shifting, right? Always orthogonal complement of psi. So it is in this sense that from Hilbert space scalar products, which are complex, which are what is it called, sesquilinear, a Hermitian. Complex conjugate of this amounts to interchanging chi prime and chi. The real part of it is therefore symmetric. Imaginary part is antisymmetric. The real part is a Riemannian metric. The imaginary part is a symplectic phase space structure. This is non-degenerate, that is non-degenerate. This is symmetric, this is antisymmetric. This is closed, which is what makes it a symplectic structure. So I don't mind saying I have not copied these expressions from any other source. They are manufactured by me in my kitchen. I just worked it out. I had to get my hands on it somehow because I have heard my close collaborators, Marmot and Morandi and others, saying, yeah, the Hilbert space, the ray space is a Kähler manifold. And every time Balachandran hears me talk about this, is, oh, but this is the bot connection or something like that, which again I don't understand. So I decided in preparing for this set of lectures, let me just compute it in a very simple-minded, tangible way. And all these expressions I did over last week before coming here, 1 week before that. And here I felt very, very relieved and very happy also, I might say, that it is in this sense that I understand that Hilbert space scalar products contain Riemannian metric ideas, contain classical phase space ideas embedded in them. Now I understand why it is such a beautiful structure. I have not introduced the word Kähler manifold here. That would. They did it for the first time. It is named after them. Huh? Yeah, okay. Yeah. That is the case we are dealing with here. Huh? Yeah, yeah, right. It is. Yeah, yeah.
We used to see, we are quite accustomed to see these in the coordinates from like dz bar by.
Okay, fine.
Should probably come also.
Fine. So, as I said, I have not done it in the way standard literature might do it. This is myself working it out for my own understanding. If it is already there in some book, I will give reference to it. Otherwise, I will patent it.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have,
So I'll just make one point and then I stop for comments. So the Riemannian metric and the symplectic structure are both determined on ray space, are both determined by Hilbert space scalar products, the real part and imaginary part respectively. From the geometric phase perspective, which is what I have been developing all along, the situation is as follows. Geodesics are determined by this part. Geometric phases are determined by this part in the sense that geometric phases are symplectic areas. Symplectic means coming from here. And how are the two tied together? We have used geodesics to interpret phases of Bargmann invariants as geometric phases. So far, we have used geodesics determined by the Riemannian metric to make the connection, Bargmann invariant to geometric phase. So it is in this way that, in my mind, all the different pieces of this jigsaw puzzle fit together up to this point. Now I will leave the floor to you. You want to make some suggestion, comment?
See, to what extent is this factor 1/2 in the imaginary part interesting? I think things in life would have been much prettier if that. So if it can be absorbed somewhere. I mean, see, supposing I take chi and chi prime.
Yeah.
Instead of that, I take chi double prime, which is I times chi prime.
Okay.
Then these two fellows will get interchanged.
Which two fellows? Oh, these two.
Real and imaginary
Yeah,
parts
yeah,
will
yeah.
get interchanged,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
And that is, that's a normally expected thing about complex structure.
Yeah,
This,
that is correct.
Factor I,
Yeah.
and this factor of half
Half.
will be floating around.
Yeah.
So probably at some stage it should be. I think you have defined the two things very independently.
Yeah.
The geometric phase
Yeah,
part and
I
the metric
agree.
part you have. So in putting together, I think this factor
Yeah.
of half is there.
I agree. See, how did I introduce these Q and P coordinates, canonical looking phase space type coordinates earlier today? It is so that omega at the end has the form we are familiar with in classical mechanics, dp wedge dq, no factor or anything. If I had defined Q's and P's differently, how did I define them? I said chi is equal to 1 by root 2 Q minus IP times that orthonormal basis. If I had altered the normalization there, I would have changed the normalization of omega. If I want omega to be dp wedge dq. So I agree there is flexibility, there is freedom in all this. Sure, one can try to make it simpler. But anyway, with my notations, normalizations, consistently doing the algebra, this is what I've got. Yeah, one can do it slightly differently. Okay, so this is the what I wanted to show Hassan. So today evening, yeah.
This expression of phi dot 21.
Huh?
This expression phi dot 21.
Huh.
It looks very similar to the uncertainty principle.
Yeah.
No, I guess the similarity.
Yeah.
Is
Variance
something that
matrix.
It may be very comment.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah.
although
Yeah. But yeah, it is. Yeah, it reminds you of that.
yeah, that's all. I don't know any.
Yeah. But as Simon said, here there is a lot of this scalar geometry present, and there is something called complex structure. So these two parts are related at a very fundamental way. They both, one comes from the other by putting this J matrix in a suitable place and so on. So I leave it to you to go further. This is just a glimpse of what is going on.
So this Frobenius 2D metric, is it very special of this Hilbert space structure? I mean, in the sense that if you want to come up with some other metric, you need to also change this omega rho.
If this Hilbert space is complex Cn, then the ray space is this complex projective space. Then, as he says, this metric is in that context, it is canonical.
I get on the problem, not a problem. There is usually people used to accustom to see this in CP and in terms of Z, but in the coordinates, super coordinates. So I am trying to see how this is matching.
This is the, I mean, the right inner product
Of course it will come.
What is
modulus of z square, something like that.
No, actually, it's not at all obvious how you, when you put in models, but it's like you use that you feel it won't come.
No, I'm not saying it won't come. I mean, it should come, but you have to compute it.
Yeah, let me just say that I have been hearing for n number of years from Marmot and other people I know that, yeah, the Hilbert space scalar product has everything in it. It has a metric, Riemannian geometry, it has symplectic structure. And there's an interesting thing. There was an Italian physicist, mathematical physicist from Naples who was once a visitor at this institute. So long ago, 40 years ago, Cainiello. Maybe some of you have heard, you know the name, huh?
I've heard the name.
You heard the name. By the way, he was a student of Marshak at Rochester, very, very long ago, much before Sudarshan also. And he was the head of the theoretical physics group in Naples in the mid-60s, early 60s, something around that time. And I had known him a little bit. Then he moved from Naples to the University of Salerno. He's no more. He was famous for writing a book on renormalization theory and quantum field theory. And it is more on combinatoric aspects of Feynman diagrams and so on. And there was something which he studied or introduced. We all know what we mean by a determinant. He introduced something called a permanent. And he studied it in very great detail. And Marmot was a kind of junior colleague of his, distant to sense, a student. And I remember in the 1960s, Marmot and Cainiello discussing with each other, partly in English, partly in Italian, such ideas that the Hilbert space scalar product contains these things. So I had never sat down and worked it out for myself in detail. I knew vaguely it is true, but only now I can see in explicit, at least in this presentation, what machinery you need to realize what those guys were saying to one another. So I feel happy and satisfied now to see a simple equation where Hilbert's scalar product has both pieces. So this is an idea which has been there in many people's minds for a long time. Okay, let me now go on to my last section. I'll go only part of the way now. I want to introduce this idea of null phase curves. This is something which we have introduced into the field. So as I said, the general connection between geometric phases and Bargmann invariants involves the concept of geodesics, which comes from this part of this expression, the symmetric positive definite, the Riemannian metric tensor part. Geodesics come from here. And as I have told you 2, 3, 4 days ago, the role of geodesics in geometric phase theory was first brought out by Samuel and Bandari. So now, if one were to stop at that point, one would imagine the only way to show that the phase of a Bargmann invariant is a geometric phase is to take the points, the vertices of the Bargmann invariant, join them pairwise by geodesics. Then you get a closed loop in ray space, a polygon, which you can call a geodesic polygon. This is exactly the kind of thing that Pancharatnam used in his studies in polarization optics. He was dealing with a spherical triangle on the Poincare sphere. So the sides were arcs of great circles. That is a kind of geometry that was involved in his calculation. Now, it turns out that, and anyway, the general demonstration that phases of Bargmann invariants are geometric phases if you do this geodesic construction. This proof was given by Simon and me in 1993. And it was used by us in a couple of ways. One of course, was in the context of Pancharatnam's work. The other was in the context of this classical optical Gauy phase. However, from that time, 1993, I had been a little uneasy that in our application of our general result to the Gauy phase, the way we connected different vertices in the Bargmann invariant was not using the geodesics that I have been describing up to now. They were not Hilbert space geodesics. So it had been in my mind that there is something to be further explored. Then also there was some nice calculation by Chaturvedi, Sriram, and V. Srinivasan. When was that? 1987. They found a nice result involving coherent states. Now, I think everybody here knows what coherent states are, what are their properties, and so on. I have all the details of their calculation given explicitly in the notes, but I will omit those because I will just show it as an example of this room for improvement, room for extension, and then I will tomorrow tell you in more detail what these null phase curves are, what role they play. But in advance I can say, so that you know where we are headed or target, the most general way in which you can relate Bargmann invariants and geometric phases is not through geodesics with respect to the Fubini's 2D metric. There is a new class of curves which we have called null phase curves, and you take a Bargmann invariant, it has, let us say, third order 3 vertices. The most general construction you can make is to connect rho 1 to rho 2 by one of these new curves, rho 2 to rho 3 by another one, and rho 3 to rho 1 by a third null phase curve. These curves are a very, very large family. In general, the geodesic from rho 1 to rho 2 is uniquely determined. Rho 2 to rho 3 unique, rho 3 to rho 1 unique. In contrast, null phase curves, given 2 points rho 1 and rho 2 in general, there are uncountably many null phase curves you can use to connect them. So you take a Bargmann invariant, 3 points, connect them not by geodesics but by any null phase curve you like from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 1. You will get a closed loop. Its geometric phase will be the phase of that Bargmann invariant. We have proved it up to now for the geodesic construction, but we found that it can be extended in an immensely large sense. So let me just quickly tell you what it is that these 3 people had done for coherent
systems.
Huh?
For 2-level systems
Huh.
on the Poincare, are they different from the data?
You hit the nail on the head, and you are hurting me a lot. On 2-dimensional Hilbert space, no difference. Null phase curves and geodesics are the same. 3 dimensions and more, there is a difference. Once you go to dimension of H, at least 3, taking 2 general points in the ray space, there are only 1 geodesic, infinitely many curves of this kind. So let me just quickly tell you what it is that they had done. Now this is a complex plane which I want to use to pictorially denote sets of coherent states. You know that for 1 degree of freedom, a coherent state is labeled by a complex number, and the Hilbert space is infinite dimensional. It's 1 degree of freedom. So suppose you take 3 coherent states, coherent state Z1, Z2, and Z3. And then you construct the corresponding Bargmann invariant, Z1, Z2, Z3. So now this Bargmann invariant depends only on the choice of these three vectors. It's an inner product, 1 with 2, 2 with 3, 3 with 1. It will have, in general, a phase. Our construction says that phase is a geometric phase for a certain closed evolution. What is that evolution? It is an evolution from Z1 to Z2 along a geodesic in Hilbert space, the way in which I have defined earlier. The equations described in geodesics I have given in great detail. So you take two vectors, coherent states Z1 and Z2, you find out what is a geodesic connecting them. So it can be easily computed. Then you ask, what is the geodesic connecting 2 to 3 and 3 to 1? The key point is, in the definition of the geodesic in the construction, you will see if Z1 is a coherent state and Z2 is a coherent state out of the family of coherent states, the geodesic running from the state Z1 to the state Z2, along the way you do not have coherent states. You have linear combinations of the coherent state Z1 and the coherent state Z2 with certain coefficients. So all along the geodesic, it's not a coherent state. But it starts at the coherent state Z1, ends at Z2. Then from Z2 to Z3, you are outside the family of coherent states, and also from Z3 to Z1. However, our theorem says, so how shall I depict that? I am going to ask you to imagine the following. I will draw a curved set of lines, and please imagine that these are some inadequate representation of these geodesics. They are not in the plane of coherent states. They are wandering outside in Hilbert space. This is a geodesic in Hilbert space according to our earlier definition. It starts at a coherent state, it ends at a coherent state. In between, the states you pass through are not coherent states. That's the key thing I'm saying. Here also, they are not coherent states. Here also, non-coherent states. However, our result says the phase of this Bargmann invariant is the geometric phase for this cyclic evolution, made up of 3 geodesics, and in this example, each of those geodesics, at each point, you are not passing through a coherent state. So this is a fact. Now, this is the meaning of our result, which I described 2-3 days ago. But what is it that Chaturvedi, Sriram, and Srinivasan found? They found, suppose you draw straight lines within the complex plane connecting Z1 to Z2, Z2 to Z3, and Z3 to Z1, passing through coherent states at every stage. For this, they compute the geometric phase. It is the same phase of this fellow. Same Bargmann invariant phase. So this is a matter which it is there in the notes. I will not repeat the calculation. What does it show you? It shows you when you want to reinterpret phases of Bargmann invariance as geometric phases, you must connect the 3 vertices to one another in some way or the other to get a continuous closed evolution, and then you can talk about its geometric phase. It is clear from this example there are at least 2 ways in which to do it in the example of coherent states. You can go via our geodesic construction, in which case you jump out of the plane of coherent states. You wander elsewhere into Hilbert space. Or you can do it the Chaturvedi, Sriram, Srinivasan way. You go from coherent state Z1 to coherent state Z2 along a line of coherent states, and then along another line of coherent states, along this line. Whichever way you connect the 3 vertices, the geometric phase for these 2 closed loops happen to be the same. And they are, both of them, the phase of this Bargmann invariant. Yeah?
This extends to all any order.
Yeah. I don't, you can do it in, it all involves geometry in the plane. our result is clear. It is true for any n. One of the equation, we generalized it. N-sided polygon, each side is a geodesic. Their calculation, I'm sure, it can, like triangulation, you can generalize it also. So this is an indication that the connection between these two objects, Bargmann invariants and geometric phases, there is more richness to it. There is not just a single way in which the two can be connected. We have found a connection via the use of geodesics. These people have shown by explicit calculation there's another way to connect them in this example. So, and as I said, the work which Simon and I did on this Gouy phase, it established a connection between a certain fourth order Bargmann invariant and a corresponding geodesic geometric phase in which the lines connecting the vertices were not geodesics of Hilbert space, not the geodesics determined by the Fubini's 2D metric. So I will stop at this point, and tomorrow I will continue this part. I will finish it tomorrow. What the question was, can you describe the most general way in which one can connect these two things? That I will show tomorrow. And the answer to that is yes, it can be done. It is a very, very nice answer. That is where this idea comes in. So let me stop at this point.